I cannot help but think that someone who advised our current president had some very clear notion that this was originally part of Ronald Reagan's campaign statement. Make America great again. And it feeds upon what fundamental worry that the American people have had now for a number of decades. I'm not saying it's an illegitimate worry either. It's a fundamental worry. What worry would that be? Yes, that they are in decline, that the country is in decline. This is a fundamental worry of every great power. There's a book called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers that was written by a professor at Yale sometime in the 80s. It got huge readership. This whole notion, what's one of the greatest histories written of the Roman Empire? It's called no, it's not called the rise and fall. Nope, it's called the decline and fall, because he doesn't actually give you the rise. He gives you only the decline. He starts with the empire at its height, basically, and then he takes the decline. That's right, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. Decline still haunts the American consciousness. We're losing our world influence. The economy is going to go sour. The country is going to be less optimistic. We're going to have more and more trouble. Inflation's going to occur. We won't have enough energy. Are these legitimate worries? Yes, from time to time, they certainly are legitimate worries. And you don't want that specter of decline to become so strong that it actually impedes the possibility of the people to do something positive. There was a period in British history in the 18th century when Britain was involved in a long and costly war, the 7 Years' War. And there was a man named John Brown, who was nicknamed John Estimate Brown, who during that period of time wrote a book called An Estimate of the Morals and Manners of Great Britain. And he talked about decline and torpor. What's torpor? T-O-R-P-O-R. Anybody know? What's torpor? It's related to torpid, yeah? Philip, try a guess. That's all right, guesses are fine.
It's like sluggishness?
Yes, yes, torpor is a kind of sense of inaction, a kind of lack of energy, like low metabolism. Another phrase for torpor that was used in the last presidential primary would be low energy. That would be a phrase. If you say someone is low energy, they are filled with torpor. And torpor is an unusual word. But, so Great Britain, even in the 18th century, was haunted by a specter already of decline. That was before it lost the American colonies. Now, the history of the British Empire, far different. But eventually, did the British Empire fall into some kind of eclipse? Yes, it did, of course. Look at those old maps where 1/4 of the world's surface was colored red. 1/4 of the world's surface was colored red because it was under the sway of the British government. And that is where the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, comes from, because it never did. And of course, slowly and surely, Britain relinquished colonies. It gave up control through conflict, through dissent, all kinds of reasons. America never had such an empire, although American influence has been very extensive. So one of the things that is said now today is, compared with what country might America be in decline? China, yes, of course, because of the huge economic might of the Chinese people, and also because of their ability increasingly to mount an effective military. So these specters or worries are quite real already in the 1980s. This is in the middle of 341. The major issue in this campaign is the direct political, personal, and moral responsibility of Democratic Party leadership in the White House and in the Congress for this unprecedented calamity. I don't think that's a true statement, but it's a little hyperbole. Unprecedented calamity which has befallen us. They tell us they've done the most that humanly can be done. Now, what was the situation at this time? Reagan is running. There was inflation, very considerable inflation, 17% a year at one time. People who got a house mortgage were being asked to pay 15 or 16% a year on their house mortgage. It's very hard to live with that kind of inflation. It eats. People who have a steady retirement income, What happens with that kind of inflation? Your income drops really quickly. Your purchasing power is shredded in the space of 5 years with high inflation. Unless Social Security keeps up with it, but Social Security couldn't keep up with it, and at this time I'm not even sure if Social Security was indexed to inflation. It is now, at least to some degree. Jimmy Carter had given a speech to the American people in which he talked about a certain lack of energy in Americans, and the speech ended up being branded by the Republican Party. Does anyone know this as the what speech? It was an almost disastrous speech by Carter, but it was characterized in a way that made it even more disastrous. It was, yeah?
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but malaise?
Malaise, yes, all right, yes, that's right. What is malaise?
I don't know what malaise means, but I know the speech was about, he was talking about how a lot of Americans had lost the American spirit and how we needed to get it back.
Yeah, he was almost blaming the American people. Not quite, I think, if you read the speech, but almost. Malaise is similar to torpor, only it's a kind of infection. It's a kind of disease. It's a kind of but Jimmy Carter never used that word in the speech, interestingly enough. Never used it. You go back and look at the speech and listen to recordings of it, the word malaise is not in there. But it was called that. And so that label stuck. And now Reagan is playing upon it. And the next page, this would be 342, right near the bottom. Thanks to the economic policies of the Democratic Party, millions of Americans find themselves out of work. Millions more have never even had a fair chance to learn new skills, hold a decent job, or secure for themselves and their families a share in the prosperity of this nation. This is placing blame on an entire party and on a president for economic difficulties. Is that fair? You're going to have to judge historically. Was it effective politically? Indeed, it was effective politically. So Reagan essentially talks about renewing the American compact and says, this is a couple pages later, some say that spirit no longer exists, but I've seen it. I've felt it all across the land, in the big cities, the small towns, and in rural America. It's still there, ready to blaze into life if you and I are willing to do what has to be done. There was something else at this very time which hung like a cloud over the entire nation for well more than a year. It's an important event in American history. What had occurred? And there was a TV show about it every single night. It was the beginning of Nightline, a show by Ted Koppel, which ran for many, many years. This was a wrenching event for Americans. Joel? Yes. The hostage crisis in Iran, where American diplomats were taken hostage. And they were held for, I think, 400 and some days. And there was a rescue mission, a military rescue mission, that was launched to save them, which ended disastrously. When helicopters collided, lives were lost, and it failed. So the country was in a dispirited condition. The media, quite understandably, would not let go of the Iranian hostage crisis. Inflation was high. There had been a crimp put on oil supply. Oil prices were high. Energy prices were high. Inflation was high. There were hostages in Iran. It was a very difficult situation. Reagan won the election. It is using circumstances to present oneself as an alternative. Reagan did this really very successfully. He also seemed to have the personal temperament and character able to do it. If you look at the end of his speech, he talks about, right near the end, a divine providence placed this land as a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe free. There's proportionality. If you're talking about the fate of a nation, can you invoke divine providence? It's risky. Lincoln invoked it. George Washington invoked it. They both did, interestingly enough. They invoked it. not out of a particular religious belief, doctrine, or dogma, but out of a sense that there was some guiding hand which was spiritual, religious, and divine. Reagan uses it. Well, of course, the Democratic Party could not let this stand, but Reagan was elected, got elected, rode out a recession, a rather bad recession, passed tax cuts, and then the economy started to take off again. And in 1984, Mario Cuomo, this is on page 354, gives another address at another convention for the Democratic Party in which he challenges Reagan's portrayal of America as a shining city on a hill. Have you ever heard that phrase, shining city on a hill? All right, let's stop and think now. We're in a university, we need to be a little scholarly about it. Where does that phrase come from?
It's a Puritan phrase.
Yeah, and where did we think the Puritans got it? Take a guess.
I'm assuming it's a biblical phrase.
Yes, a city on a hill. Interestingly enough, in the Bible, it's not a shining city on a hill. It's a city on a hill. And interestingly enough, the phrase shining city on a hill doesn't exactly capture the biblical meaning. When Winthrop used it, what he really meant was in the sense of you build a city on a hill where everyone can see what you're doing and where your virtue can be openly tested. Nothing particularly positive about it in the way he used it. But very cleverly, Reagan or his speechwriter inserted the word shining in front of the phrase and made it into a shining city on a hill. Well, that's not the biblical phrase at all. It's not what it meant originally. It's not what the Puritans meant by it either. They meant they were going to the New World to try out something and the world could examine to see whether they were successful or not. But how often had that phrase now reverberated down in American political history? Even to this day, it has. Now, but Cuomo says, no, this is not what's going on. He says, instead of a shining city, we have a tale of two cities. And he's referring there to Paris and London in Charles Dickens' novel. He's referring to a city cast in great tumult versus one that is not. Edwards, John Edwards, who ran for, vice president for the Democrats, also had a very effective campaign slogan and message while he ran, in which he talked about to what? Anybody know? This is before your probably political consciousness got really wakened, but it's an interesting, important fact in American political history because it is still being talked about in slightly different terms. Edwards says there is a tale of two Americas. And he said there's an America that's getting richer and better off, and there's an America that is struggling and not moving forward. What Edwards was talking about and what Cuomo is talking about in rebuttal to Reagan is growing wealth inequality. Growing wealth inequality. So, he calls on Reagan to recognize this, and he calls on the Democratic Party to turn its energies to the forgotten. He also ends this speech with a series of we believes, we believe, we believe, which is a fairly effective way. Cuomo was a very fine speaker, and if you ever get a chance to listen on a YouTube or something else to Cuomo, I would suggest doing it. He's extremely effective. There's something very, very important about him. I question the editor. Take a look at page 355. I question the editor. I'd have to check it, but I can't find it, where he attributes to Reagan the statement, government can't do everything, which I can easily imagine Reagan saying. But then he goes on, and it's put in quotation marks, quote, so it should settle for taking care of the strong and hope that economic ambition and charity will do the rest, make the rich richer, and what falls from their tables will be enough for the middle class and those who are trying desperately to make it into the middle class. I'll have to check and see if Reagan actually said that. When I read that again, I thought, I'm be a rather remarkable thing for Reagan to say, but perhaps he did. So maybe somebody could check and see if they can find that actually in Reagan's statements. So I've tried in going over some of these speeches to give you a sense of some of American political history in the last few decades and the fact that these leitmotifs, these themes, these arguments persist. They're there. The language that is used to deal with them varies somewhat. But if you don't have in your memory and consciousness some of it, you don't know what is new, you don't know what is recycled, and you sometimes don't know what is true. I'd also say something else about these speeches. They're wonderful to study, they're interesting, they're important, but they are absolutely insufficient as a guide for what was actually going on in the country at the time. Okay? So, my point here is that as you read this kind of political rhetoric, it is fairly deceptive and even perhaps at times illusory unless you immerse yourself in real history, in studies, in statistical reports, in hard research. And that is something that doesn't get the headlines, it doesn't get the attention, it doesn't get the sound bites. That is something, however, that needs to be done. Now, are some politicians capable of doing that? Yes, Moynihan was capable of it. Bill Clinton was notoriously capable of it because somebody would ask him a question in an interview and he'd go on for 45 minutes about policy details. This was a bit of an Achilles heel because sometimes you lose your audience if you do that. But he could do it. He knew it. He knew the things. So I want to leave with you this sense that while studying this kind of rhetoric for public issues and public policy is important, it has to be supplemented with something else that we're not studying and that we're not reading. And that actually is a citizen's duty as much as it is anyone else's. You've got to do it. If you don't do it, you're going to get different distorted pictures of what is true, and then you'll have to sort those out without actual aid. Thank God there are institutions and individuals in the country whose object it is not to write political rhetoric, but to actually do those reports, to actually provide that kind of data, to actually be repositories of some kind of accurate record. And without consulting those, we're eventually going to be completely lost. It's just a matter of time. So let's pause for a second, take a look at your class outline for today. You'll be reading over the course of the next week or so, section in Corbett in Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student on schemes and tropes. As I mentioned earlier, while it would be good for you to know the names of these, it's more important for you to be able to recognize when they are being used and to use them yourself. There's a brief list of schemes. Schemes are words in certain order. They are not metaphors or similes. They're not saying something that is figurative or non-literal. Rather, it is an artful construction of words. So I've listed some here. And now, just for the last 12 minutes or so, I want you to look at page 364 at Elie Wiesel's address at the White House. Ronald Reagan was going to make a trip to West Germany. He was going to visit a place called Bitburg. He was going to lay some wreaths in a cemetery at Bitburg. In one part of that cemetery were buried some former SS officers from World War II. The SS was a part of the German military machine that was known to be particularly ruthless. Reagan said he was going to visit the cemetery anyway when it was pointed out to him that these SS officers were buried there. And in fact, he did end up visiting the cemetery. He did go. Elie Wiesel is asking him not to go to that cemetery. Let's start in the second paragraph. It was given to me by the American people for my writings, teaching, and for my testimony. When I write, I feel my invisible teacher standing over my shoulders, reading my words and judging their veracity. And while I feel responsible for the living, I feel equally responsible to the dead. Their memory dwells in my memory. The entire speech is fairly simple language, but let's look at it a little more closely. I feel, I feel, I feel. If you look at the list of figures of speech, what would I feel be?
Is that like an example of parallelism?
Well, yes, it could be seen as parallelism, but the actual use of I feel just 3 times in a row, what would that be? Anaphora. That's right. It's anaphora. It's a use of the same phrase at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. Now, there's also parallelism here. I would agree. And there's even antithesis. What does the antithesis consist in? And while I feel responsible for the living, I feel equally responsible to the dead. That's antithesis of a sort, the living and the dead, responsible to one, responsible to another. Parallelism often goes with antithesis, not always. But you have this, and sometimes they're antithetical in some kind of way. What about their memory dwells in my memory? That's interesting. Use of a word at the beginning and at the end. Well, is that polyptoton? No, maybe, not sure. Polyptoton, that's words used or repeated from the same root word. Well, it's the same word. It's memory and memory. So, yeah, maybe it's anadiplosis. Anadiplosis is described here as a last phrase repeated or used to begin, then a new one. Yeah. Their memory dwells in my memory. 40 years ago, a young man awoke and he found himself an orphan in an orphaned world. Now, what is orphan and orphaned? It's an effective use. What would it fit here on this list? It's just a past participle, but orphaned is a verbal past participle used as an adjective, and orphan is a noun.
Polyptoton?
Yeah, the polyptoton. Poly simply means multi, right? So it's a polyptoton. It's used in a different way. Then he says, what I have learned in the last 40 years, what have I learned? Small things. I learned, I learned, I learned. And there again, we have what? Yes? Next paragraph. Today is April 19, and on April 19, 1943, April 19, a very important date in American history too, but Elie Wiesel is saying it's an important date otherwise too. It's the date of the Warsaw Ghetto. They rose in arms against the onslaught of the Nazis. They were so few and so young and so helpless. And then farther down, and yet they managed to fight and resist and push back. Now that's not normally what you'd write. Why and? That would be an example of what? If asyndeton is without connection or conjunctions, what is polysyndeton? With many conjunctions, with many connections. And you've heard that often. Haven't you? Sometimes someone say, and this, and this, and this, instead of 1, 2, and. It's done for emphasis. It's done for emphasis. And yet the leaders of the free world, Mr. President, knew everything and did so little or nothing. It's a form of apposition. So little or nothing. Or, at the least, nothing specifically to save Jewish children from death. You spoke of Jewish children, Mr. President. 1 million Jewish children perished. And here again, a very effective use of that kind of repetition. Mr. President, I have seen children, I have seen them being thrown in the flames alive. And this is true from Elie Wiesel's own testimony. Words, they die on my lips. Now you see how unusual sentence order can come into play. There's a heightened emotional situation. Words, they die on my lips. Not words die on my lips, but words, they die on my lips. There's a slowing down. There's a certain solemnity now. So I have learned the fragility of the human condition, and I am reminded of a great moral essayist, the gentle and forceful Abe Rosenthal. And so, now, as you read through this address by Elie Wiesel, try this exercise, and I've asked Samuel to make sure that sections this week concentrate on schemes and tropes, so you begin to get an ear for them and an eye for them. As you read through the rest of Elie Wiesel's address, I want you to try to identify the schemes in it. And I would just say to you in my own notes as I go down, I have opposition, parentheses, anastrophe, polysyndeton. I've got chiasmus, anadiplosis, parallelism, epistrophe, climax, more anaphora, more anadiplosis, anaphora, opposition, asyndeton, parallelism. It goes on and on. Did Elie Wiesel construct his speech consciously in this manner? Yes, I believe he did. He did. It's a very serious, weighty, and solemn subject. And when you have that kind of proportionality, you can, in an admonitory or prophetic mode, employ more schemes and tropes. Martin Luther King Jr. did this very effectively. What does admonitory mean? If you get an admonitory note from your resident academic dean, what does that mean? Well, it's sort of reprimanded or warned, at least. Yes, warned, yes. So in an admonitory or a prophetic tone, using tropes and schemes is more effective because it heightens the logos, it underscores the logos through word order, and it underscores very often the sense of pathos. And the more that you consciously use it, the more your hearer or reader will realize that you feel there's a necessity for this. And in a sense, it helps underscore ethos too, as well. It can. It's very effective. But again, I'd say I wouldn't use this if you're arguing for a new vending machine in the house grill. That's not where you need this kind of speaking. But you might need this kind of speaking if there was some serious racial or ethnic incident and somebody had done something that brought up the kinds of memories that Elie Wiesel says should not die, say from the Holocaust or from lynchings or from improper kinds of criminal prosecution, you name it. And so, this kind of address you will very often find in the American consciousness is very often found in the Hebrew prophets. Now, for those of you who haven't read the Hebrew prophets, it would be prophets such as Isaiah or Jeremiah. In other words, or in classical literature, it would be voices like Cassandra, who tried to warn the city of Troy that there was something fishy about that horse, that big wooden horse, and they shouldn't let it in to the city. That admonitory or prophetic kind of speech is heightened, and it very often employs such schemes and tropes. So Elie Wiesel is really asking the president not to go to this cemetery. There is a kind of admonitory tone. But Wiesel has to be cautious too because he has no power to effect this. He's just been given a medal by the president, and now he's going to use this opportunity to make this plea. As you go through this address or others, pull out your marker, pull out your pencil, and identify as many schemes and tropes as you can. Because when you master the use of these, your prose will enliven itself enormously. It really will. And you'll say, well, I'm going to try sometime to do it, and it won't work. And I'll say, that's right. Anybody here use a bow and arrow archery? Anybody? Yeah, Joel? First time you picked it up, did you expect to hit a bullseye? It's just easy, right? You just kind of, boom, and it just hits, right? No. What do you have to do? Practice, practice, practice. And at a certain point, you can rather instinctively do that. The same with these tropes and figures. You'll miss the mark in using them sometime. You'll overshoot. They'll be a little awkward. They might not apply. But the more that you use them, the more that they become part of your repertoire of things that you have, the more effective your prose and your speaking will be. It will surprise people pleasantly. They'll remember it more strongly.